connecting two files. The file connector gives Mule applications the ability to both read and write files in the local file system. We can read files every certain period of time and delete, move, or leave the file as is once it's processed. We can copy files from one directory to another, read input files while saving a backup and input file, create new files with specific names, and append output to existing files. All of this able to be done while streaming the file as well. Now, using the file as an inbound endpoint. To use it as an inbound endpoint, we simply add the file endpoint to the source section of a flow. This has a polling mechanism that will allow us to check files in a location at some frequency. It triggers a flow whenever it receives an incoming file, reads the file into the payload, and dispatches the message to the next processor. Again, it can be a stream at this point, so it doesn't have to necessarily load the entire file into memory. By default, it consumes a file, but it can also move and/or rename the file, and it can filter the file it reads by different name patterns. By default, the file endpoint is going to use streaming, as I had mentioned earlier. The payload will be a file input stream, and the streams are closed by transformers reading the input stream. You can turn off streaming if you want, and this will give you a full byte array representation of the data from the file. It does not require a connector configuration, so this is an endpoint that you can have standalone without a global element accompanying it. But you can create a connector configuration for additional configs like setting properties such as auto-delete and streaming, and also giving you something that's reusable. So if you have multiple file endpoints, they can all inherit configuration from that global connector configuration. Now, if you want the file to be in a writing mode or an output mode, you can add the file endpoint to the process section of a flow. It will serve as an outbound endpoint, passing files to the connected file system. It can generate new files or append content to an existing file, and the file name can be set at runtime based on an expression. So let's work with files ourselves. In walkthrough 11.2, we're going to connect to a file. We'll add and configure a file endpoint to watch an input directory, read the contents of any added files, and then rename and move those files. We'll use DataWeave to convert a CSV file to a string, and add a CSV file to the input directory, and watch it be renamed and moved. We'll restrict the type of file to read, and add payload metadata to the file endpoint. Let's get started. Inside of APDev examples, we're going to make sure that we are inside of our accounts flow here, and I'll close out some of these extra tabs. From here, we're going to go into source main resources, and we will right-click on source main resources and create a new folder. The first folder that we will create will be called input, and then let's repeat that process and make another folder called output. With our input and output folder in place, we'll again make sure that we are in the accounts XML, and let's drag a file connector from the palette and drop it in the canvas so it creates a new flow. I'll move this down a little bit, and inside of the palette, type in file. Again, dragging that into the canvas so it creates another flow. Now, I'll select the file endpoint inside of here, and with the file endpoint selected, I'll start off by actually going to the flow and renaming that. Make sure we don't forget that piece. Call this getCSV accounts flow, and then go back and select the file endpoint, in which I can begin the configuration of this file endpoint. So, again, this is going to pull on an interval that we can specify. The path to this endpoint is going to be source main resources input. This way, when the project runs, it knows to look right in source main resources. And this is just a path that works locally in Studio for the sake of demonstration. Our move to directory is going to be source main resources output. And now we should be good. Now, let's add a transform message component to the process section of the flow so we can alter the body of this message. So we'll type in transform message, drag that into the process phase here. Now, in the transform message properties view, if we bring this up just a little bit, bring this out so you can see it, you will see there are some pieces of metadata that are already available to us about the file, allowing us to have information, say if we wanted to filter or do different types of transforms based on it. We're going to start with a very simple transform. We'll keep it as application Java for the moment, and we'll just simply type in payload. Now, we'll put a logger at the very end of this flow. That way it's easier for us to troubleshoot. And inside of the logger view, we'll double click and let's go ahead and log the payload in this case. We'll save everything up and let's run the project. Now, assuming the project starts successfully, the file endpoint should begin listening into that endpoint, or folder rather, based on the default interval. So if we drop a file in, we should be able to see it go from the input to output directory, along with whatever transformation happens here occur. Now, we'll navigate into our student files and see if we can locate an example data file that we can use. Inside of student files, under the resources directory, you should be able to locate an account CSV. I'd like you to drag account CSV into the input directory here and be sure to copy that file. Once you've copied it in, you should see your logger start to trigger off. Now, if we scroll to the right, we can see that the logger message processor from the get CSV accounts flow thread had gone in and logged out the final result of what it had transformed. So you can see the data inside of the CSV file. If we go back to our student files, we can see that the CSV data looks roughly like this. And once the transformation goes through, you can validate that the data looks similar here as well. In fact, to make it a bit easier for you to see, I'll go inside of the preferences for this window and be sure to do a fixed width console so that it can wrap a little bit easier for you here. Okay, there we go. So if I scroll down, you can see the data inside of here wrapping around in the logger with all of the different objects inside. Now, if we go to source main resources and hit F5 on our keyboard or right click and refresh, we can then go down to the output directory and see that accounts.csv has been moved appropriately. All right, so let's go ahead and stop the project and let's add a breakpoint onto the logger itself. Now we'll go ahead and debug the project this time. And once this project has started in debug mode, we're going to move the accounts CSV file from the output folder back into the input folder. So going back to the Package Explorer, once it's started up, we'll take accounts and move that up into input, in which case we should very quickly end up with our breakpoint on the logger. If we open up the payload inside of here and scroll down, we can see the 3 objects that were picked up accordingly inside, and then in each of the objects you can see the various fields that it was able to convert to a map based on the transformer. Also in the inbound properties, you can see some data that came off that object initially, such as how big the file size is, what the directory was, original directory file name, and a timestamp as well. All right, let's resume through, check our console again. We should once again see that the object was printed out, and we'll stop the project. Now, let's assume that you don't want the file endpoint to pick up every type of file, but instead it only picks up certain files based on a pattern. A very common use case that's also easy to achieve. If we select the file endpoint inside of here and look in the file name regex filter, we can hit add. And with add in place, we'll put an expression in that will say all characters up to CSV are valid for the pattern. We'll also uncheck case sensitive, so effectively any file with .csv at the end should be picked up accordingly. Now the next thing that we'll do is we'll go to our move to pattern. Let's now assume that we want to keep the original file name, but we want to append .backup to the end of it so that if that backup file ever gets put back in the input directory, it doesn't get picked up because of our new regex. Inside of the move to pattern, we'll put in an expression. You may recall that there were inbound properties that had metadata about the object. In the inbound properties, we can go ahead and put in our own property here, which was original file name. And with that in place, we'll do .backup at the very end. So we'll take the original file name from the inbound properties, append .backup to the very end, and that will be what will show up in our backup. So once again, let's save the project and run it in normal mode. From the Package Explorer, we may need to refresh our source main resources again. And in this case, we'll take account CSV and bring it back up into input one more time. processing should occur. But this time, if we refresh again and look in our output directory, you'll notice that it's now been appended with .backup. To test that our file matching is working, let's now drag it up to input one more time, and you'll notice that even after a refresh, the logger does not trigger and it does not process, and this is because it no longer satisfies that regex because it does not end with .csv or have all characters up to CSV. It has CSV and then .backup at the very end as well. All right, now we can see that this has not been picked up. We'll go ahead and right-click, refactor, and rename. And then we'll go ahead and rename it to accounts.csv to let it process through one more time. All right, and one more refresh through, and we can see it's now in the output folder once again. Great. So let's go ahead and stop our runtime for the time being. We'll double click on the file endpoint, and let's go down to the metadata tab for the file endpoint. We'll then click add metadata. And in the drop-down here, we're going to be able to select what the metadata coming out of the file connector is. This will make it easier for us to transform downstream because it will be aware of what the available fields are. So we'll make sure that output payload is selected. From here, let's click the edit button next to output payload. Inside of here, we can see the different metadata that it's aware of. And let's do the add button to add a new piece of metadata that we are going to call accounts_CSV and hit create type. The type in this case is going to be a CSV file. And inside of here, we'll make sure that the CSV includes header row is checked because it is part of our CSV. Let's now click the folder icon, and we're going to load up an example CSV inside of here. We'll browse out, and from within source main resources, we should be able to go to our output directory and choose the account CSV backup. And you can also browse to the original account CSV as well if you had renamed it, or if you just want to go directly to your student files and grab that. We'll hit OK. Keep ignored rows as 0, delimiter is standard, and now you should be able to see that in the configuration preview, it's parsed and is aware of all of the various fields. Let's hit OK, and then inside of this preview window here, we can also see the name and the various types of those fields. All right, let's now hit select. And if we go to the output tab in our metadata explorer, you'll notice that Studio is now aware of what the data structure is coming out of this file connector. Again, helping us with transformations in a little bit later in this module. Let's save this up and return to our slides to talk a little bit about pulling these different resources.